Symbolic of a deeply dysfunctional world order, elite philanthropy promises salvation while legitimizing the continued existence of extreme inequalities, potentially fostering dependency. That damning statement was taken from a new study entitled Elite Philanthropy in the United States and United Kingdom in the New Age of Inequalities. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome back to Spar&Brawl. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by one of the study's co-authors, Professor Charles Harvey from Newcastle University. He's Professor of Business History and Management and the Director of the Newcastle Center for Research on Entrepreneurship, Wealth, and Philanthropy. Professor, thank you very much for joining us today. I was just telling you off camera how interesting your paper is, not only the topic, but the way it was written, and you didn't really shy away from making your point. So I encourage everybody to go and read the article after watching this interview, of course. But so you and your co-authors examined elite philanthropy done by British and American individuals and family, and you based your research on a comprehensive review of the existing research. So can you please just start by sharing the main point, your overall findings?
Yes, thank you, Cam. Well, the main point overall is to say this, that the world is a deeply divided place, and a lot of the resources in the world are controlled by a very small number of people, really. And so the question is philanthropy part of the solution to this injustice, essentially? And we find that essentially to date, so far, the level of redistribution from philanthropy to the poor is relatively small. Okay, that's the main finding. And there are three reasons for this. First of all, most wealthy people do not give at scale, okay? So that's an important factor, that the philanthropists themselves are very generous, but they are the minority of the wealthy. The second is the philanthropists themselves, in the main, give to elite causes in rich countries. And the third factor is little of the money to date has flowed to developing countries where the majority of poor people are. So this, of course, it leads you to a situation in which the redistributive effect of philanthropy is relatively small to date. There are some signs that this is beginning to change, and that indeed elite philanthropists are beginning to take a stronger interest in developing countries and the plight of the poor. But that's really a feature of the last 5 years. So to date, we don't have a lot of data to say that philanthropy at scale by elite philanthropists is massively redistributive from rich to poor. So that is the number one finding of the research.
Okay, and so can we dig a bit deeper into some of the impact that elite philanthropy has?
Okay, so, well, overall, the impact of elite philanthropy, we have to say, is positive. That would be to deny the evidence to suggest that good things aren't being done. Good things are being done, and they're being done quite considerably. So if we take the area, for example, of the eradication of polio, that, of course, is identified very strongly with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It would be churlish and wrong to suggest that this hadn't been a successful campaign. It has, and many of the at-scale health campaigns have indeed been successful. So there is a positive effect, but the predominant effect of spending by wealthy philanthropists is in the already developed countries. And it is very much on elite causes. So for example, it's to support the top universities in the United States, like Harvard and Yale, or in the United Kingdom, Oxford and Cambridge. The trickle-down effect to the masses is relatively small, therefore, and it dilutes the overall impact. So this really has been a question of what are the priorities of elite philanthropists? How can they better direct their wealth? And how can more elite philanthropists, many more of the wealthy, be brought into the philanthropic net? So if philanthropy at scale is to be a solution to the world's ills, then we need more people to get involved in this movement. At the moment, there are 200 plus members of the Giving Pledge. That's people who've signed up to give away a large proportion of their wealth in their lifetime. But of course, we're talking here about needing tens of thousands of people to join in this giving movement to actually have a more major effect.
Okay, so this is all very interesting. So one misconception that you actually found is that elite philanthropy, all of the money is given to, I mean, you studied British and American individuals, so a lot of it is spent in the US or in the UK rather than in developing countries. And so,
That is correct.
Mhm. And so you also mentioned that not all elites partake in philanthropy. And then you mentioned, well, if we want to be a solution, maybe more people should engage in, more elites should engage in philanthropy. Although I feel from your paper, you wouldn't think that would necessarily be a good solution. But before getting to that, why do those elites who do engage in philanthropy, why do they love engaging in philanthropy so much?
Well, it's more or less the same story that you get when you interview philanthropists. There are only so many cars, houses, planes, playthings that you can actually have and consume. And you're left still with a vast fortune, the income from which greatly exceeds any needs you might possibly want to have. So therefore, the temptation or the desire is to do something better with the money, to do something that will lead a legacy of the self. This is something we call generativity, a legacy of the self that is actually good for you and good for society as a whole. And of course, at the same time, it increases the status and the power and the influence of those of wealth who give, because what they're doing effectively is to extend the reach of their influence away from simply the business sector into social and political affairs. So it increases their influence, it increases their status, and it increases their sense of being worthwhile and having a purpose to play in life, which is beyond narrow piling up of mountains and mountains of money.
So in fact, it is also very beneficial to them, right, to partake in this philanthropy. Besides having a purpose in life, in addition to spending money, it actually also helps them to continue to increase their status.
It does. It's a two-way street, philanthropy. It's not a one-way street. It's not simply giving and not receiving something back. In fact, the rewards and satisfactions of philanthropy are very, very considerable. So the satisfactions are being experiencing doing good and seeing your spending doing good. The rewards themselves are rewards of status and increased power and authority in society. So it increases that side of your life.
And you also talk specifically about legitimacy in the context of elite philanthropy. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, the concept of legitimacy is really about acceptance. Legitimacy, some act or purpose is legitimate when society as a whole accept that this is a fair and reasonable thing or a fair and reasonable arrangement. So it's about social acceptance. Now, in this case, legitimacy means acceptance that differentials in wealth and income, profound differentials, are acceptable. People will buy into these differentials, providing that the rich are seen to be giving back and doing good. So legitimacy comes from acceptance that the wealthy are not all bad, that they themselves see that we are all in it together and that we are doing something with these fortunes to actually make a difference for society as a whole and not just for ourselves. And it's in that sense that we understand legitimacy. And philanthropy certainly has that effect. So it's one of its powerful effects. It's to buy into the status quo in terms of inequality, if you like.
Okay, so I mean, it kind of justifies the status quo and justifies the fact that they are this rich in the eyes of the population.
Yeah, those who are giving, the philanthropists, we believe are extremely sincere in what they're doing. We've met and interviewed many philanthropists. There is no doubt about their sincerity, their desire to do good, and in fact that they do good, that they are having an impact. We're not questioning those things. But for all those who don't give, the free riders of the welfare, the free riders, the ones who are not giving back anything very much, they really are bought into the legitimacy game alongside those who are actually leading the way and giving at scale.
And did you ever have any interviews or conversations with elites who don't partake in elite philanthropy that much? I mean, I'm sure they do a little bit, but they don't partake in it that much. And have they told you why, perhaps?
These interviews are extremely difficult to get. Any
Right.
elite interviews with people who give or don't give are extremely hard to come across. So I would say that's a weak side of our research, actually. We don't really know what those who simply accumulate fortunes, defend fortunes do. We know how they do it, right? So there is enough research out there to know that. So you probably gather from the paper, what actually happens is the wealthy have things called family offices. So the family is the unit here that's important. And the fortunes of the family are managed and defended by family offices. And these family offices have got very clever people running them, managers, money managers, and so on. And they can buy in expertise in finance, and they can buy in expertise in the law. And this allows them to actually defend these very large fortunes by pushing the money around and keeping it safe from those who would actually take it away from them. For instance, the taxman or others who are really, not on their side, as it were. So there's a lot of effort goes into defending large fortunes. And that is very important. Philanthropy is part of what family offices do for those who choose to give. And that would be managed through a family office typically as well.
And maybe I should have asked this earlier on, but can you just define quickly what you mean by elite philanthropy? Because you point out in your paper there are a lot of non-elites who also engage in, call it donations perhaps, and not
Yeah,
philanthropy, and which adds up to quite a large sum itself. But can you just distinguish between them?
yeah. There's mass philanthropy. That's the kind of giving that you or I might do. And we are giving it a relatively modest scale because our means are relatively modest. And elite philanthropists typically can make regular gifts in excess of $1 million. And some of these gifts, of course, extend to billions of dollars. And they're very substantial amounts of money indeed. So it's talking about wealthy people who give at scale and regularly make donations of $1 million plus.
Okay, so I'm just going to read a little extract from your paper, which shows really what I was saying about how it's written. So you wrote that elite philanthropy can function as a form of soft power. And then you also wrote that philanthropy is part of a wider game of neoliberal ideological control supported by an army of legal and financial advisors, so all the professionals you just mentioned that the family hires, who protect the privileges of wealthy people. So can you expand on this statement again, please?
Well, I've expanded a little bit already, haven't I, on how
Yes.
the wealthy actually operate. So they've got the best legal advice, they've got the best financial advice, they've got the best tax advice, and all of that is a feature of actually defending the fortunes that they hold. What they do is they typically then, the philanthropists themselves, would make a very substantial transfer of wealth at a particular point of time into a foundation. Okay, that's a very regular thing. So the accompaniment to great wealth is having a foundation from which you control, and which you then support causes that you're keen to promote in the social world. Soft power simply means, well, what you have is if you have a lot of resource and you are deploying that resource to good, then effectively people will buy into you and will buy into your projects. And they will, of course, buy into your nation. So if the United States has a lot of very powerful billionaires who are giving around the world, that, of course, gives them and confers upon them a kind of power and authority in other places in which they can help shape policy and practice in those countries. So that's the way soft power works.
And so you mentioned, oh, sorry, please.
No, you've gone.
So I was going to say, you mentioned earlier on in the interview that the biggest benefactors are universities in developed countries. I mean, in the case that you studied UK and the US, is there anything you can add about that?
Well, universities are geared up to receiving large gifts, and they know what to do with them. They can build a new institute, a new building, and form a new research program. So a lot of big philanthropy is spent on universities, and in particular on research and developing research institutes and endowing research institutes. So what they do is they support these causes because they promise big gains. So if you find solutions to coronavirus, for example, that is a major win for the world and for philanthropy. So universities and top scientific talent in particular are things that are seen worth investing in. So it's particularly around medical science and big science in terms of finding solutions to the world's ills, solutions, for example, of power generation, environment, and so on. So universities are geared up to this, and the best universities, what they do, the most authoritative universities, is they are able to buy in top scientific talent because of philanthropy. It helps them and gives them a competitive advantage.
So
So
we see.
that's the university side. But it's, of course, giving isn't solely to universities. Giving at scale can be directly on environmental projects or campaigns against smoking, or, there are a multitude of causes that are supported.
And so now we've talked about all these different reasons why they would give money. And of course, at the end, if something happens, like, some kind of new medical advancement or breakthrough, it is very advantageous also to the philanthropist. But I guess at a very basic level, at least in the US, you're also not going to pay taxes because you're you're donating money, right? So that is also reduced from your taxes. Did that come across as one of the main reasons in your research?
Well, it's very interesting that philanthropists and charities generally, and the whole of the philanthropic charitable sector nexus, will always defend the tax advantages of philanthropy because they see that as a means of drawing more money into it. Of course, when a philanthropist gives, they are giving real money. They are giving their own money, but they are allowed to give more money because they can offset that against tax. So a large proportion of what they give is then supercharged. They receive an additional premium. In the UK, it's called gift aid. It's a way of the government saying, okay, we'll allow you to write off part of your tax bill, providing that goes to a philanthropic or charitable cause. So what it does, it multiplies the value of the gift. It's not that the philanthropist isn't giving, it multiplies the value of the gift.
You mean
that's true both in the United States and so if you're what's called an itemizing taxpayer in the United States, that means you issue a separate return and you list, you can say, one of my expenses in life is philanthropy. And that element of it is non-tax chargeable. That's how it works.
I see. And this is, of course, open to anyone who gives donations, but of course, you have to give a big scale for it to make an impact, I guess, for your own
It's open to itemizing taxpayers in the United States, and in the UK, which has a very generous regime, it's open to all taxpayers. So gift aid in the UK is universal.
Okay. And then, so in your paper, you talk about this. This is very interesting. You talk about large endowments. So can you first explain what that means a little bit, and then the role it plays in elite philanthropy?
Yeah. An important thing to recognize with endowment is that these philanthropic systems have existed for hundreds of years, since medieval times. The form of these have changed over time, progressively. But if you just take the medieval example, because it's instructive, what would happen is, say, for example, William conquers England. He divides up England and he divides up the land to great landowners. And the great landowners themselves rent out the land in terms of farms and townships and so on. What they would typically do is give a block of those to the church. They build a church and they give a block of land, and then the rental incomes from the land would flow to the church or to the body they've established. And that's called endowing. It's endowing with land, with real property. Now, when you come into the modern age, you don't endow with land and real property. You endow with money. So you've made a vast fortune and you give to an institution or to a foundation a block of cash. Now, this is a block of financial assets is the best way to put it. So, for example, Warren Buffett might give the Gates Foundation tens of billions of Ward Hathaway stock. This stock will then be sold and accumulated as a pile of financial assets in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it's from that pile of financial assets that income flows. So it's the share income, it's the interest received on these financial assets that forms the money for philanthropic gifts. So you have large reservoirs of cash, of financial assets, I should say, large reservoirs, and they're called endowment. And it's the income from those pools, reserves of financial assets that actually enable philanthropy to take place.
Okay, so if I understood, for instance, I'm a foundation, you give me $10 million, I won't just go and spend this money on a project. I will try to, with the other money that I've received, I put it all together, I try to make money out of this money, and then with that income, I tend to go and spend it on projects or whatever my mission is.
Yeah, it's slightly more complicated than
Of course.
it can work in one of two ways. Either you can give to endowment, that's what you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, I might have made a lot of money and I might want to give back to my university $10 million, as you say. And I'm going to say, you can put that into endowment, and then the income will continue to flow in perpetuity from that endowment. Or I could say, you've got a campaign going and you're building a new complex of buildings for medical science, and I want my 10 billion to go directly into that. So that's the alternative. You can spend now, in the here and now, or you can put it into endowment, and that will yield longer term benefits from the flow of income. That's how it works. One of those two choices.
Okay, perfect. I think I got it. Very interesting. So thank you again, Professor. So I have a final question. Can you again just summarize how your conception and understanding of elite philanthropy based on your research differs from the mainstream view of it?
Well, I want to issue a slightly qualified answer. Okay, so the qualified answer is this. A lot of what we've written is articulating what philanthropy is and how it actually works. So it's trying to articulate how the system is functioning. And beyond that, what we're trying to say is that a lot of good is done by philanthropy in its customary form. So in its customary form, what happened was you had a foundation, people applied to you for money, charities, and then this money flowed out into the sector. And what it did was basically nourish good things, generally at a local level. But in the new age, in which we've got far greater resources, potential resources available, and these are highly concentrated in the hands of mega foundations or concentrated in the hands of elite institutions like top universities, then you've got a much greater concentration of power. And that these really are largely unaccountable. They're not democratic, are they? So they're not deciding. We don't have a say in how this is to be spent. Large philanthropy has a say in how this is spent. And that's the big change that's happened. So it's a proportionate change. And it's greatly increased the sway, the power of the philanthropic community, the elite philanthropic community, now has far more power than it ever had in the past. And this is a very important moment for society as a whole. You think about this. We can't go on with this kind of tremendous disparity where a few hundred people have got the same resources as countless billions, and you weigh those out. We've got to find a way, really, of putting this wealth to work for the cause of society as a whole, and that means global society, because we don't want these inequalities to persist. And so really our paper is a clarion call for saying, hey, come on, let's look at this. Let's look at what objectively is happening to the money. And let's think collectively, can this be done better? And so we're trying to contribute to a conversation about, can elite philanthropy be improved?
And then, sorry, actually one more question. But in the beginning of the interview, you mentioned how there's been a shift in the mindset of perhaps elite philanthropy, if I understood correctly, in the past 5 years. Can you just go over that again?
Well, what I was referring to there was, we know this was a question of between developed and developing countries. And just one, this is just a fact, if you like. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, gathers data and maintains data, a database of flows of aid from developed to developing countries. And they're recording these flows of cash, and most aid to developing countries is government sponsored. Okay, so it comes from the British government or the US government or whoever is contributing to these transfers between developed and developing countries. Now, until recently, private philanthropy was only making a very small contribution to those redistributive flows to support projects in developing countries. But the shift that's taking place is you can now see there's an upward trend in private philanthropy to developing countries, but it's still dwarfed by government flows or government support. That's the reference I was making earlier.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much again, Professor Charles, and really encourage everybody to go and read your paper. I'm sure there's a bunch of things that we didn't get to hear. Is there anything that you'd like to add before we wrap up this interview?
I think so. I think basically I'd want to say this is not a paper speaking against philanthropy. This is a paper speaking positively for philanthropy, but wanting philanthropy to be considered as part of a solution. And to do that, we need a dialogue with the wealthy. And the wealthy need to engage in a dialogue more openly with the rest of society about what is to happen to their wealth. The giving pledge itself is not enough of a dialogue or a discourse. We need a wider dialogue that involves many of us, not the few. And that is a very important democratic principle. It's a very important thing. Because obviously I'm very in favor as a business school academic of entrepreneurship and wealth creation. But I want to see that that leads to a fair result in the end. I don't want it to lead to an unfair result for the majority of people. And that's really the point that we're making.
And right now, we're unfortunately on the other trajectory that you think we should change.
I think we need a greater debate, a greater and more open debate. I think it's very important to point out that the majority of wealthy people do not give significantly, okay? I think it's very important to say that, and I think it's important to question whether that is right, simply to go on accumulating very large fortunes and protecting them by all legal means, so that this disparity in the distribution of world resources continues. I think we need to end that. I think that's very, very important that we get a different mindset in the world.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Charles. Really fascinating and interesting, and I'll link to the study in the description box below. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you like the content, please make sure to like and subscribe and share your thoughts in the comment section below, and we'll make sure to get to them. So thank you again, Professor Charles. Very interesting paper, and congratulations on publishing it. And thank you for watching this video.
Thank you, Cam. A pleasure.